Welcome to the Feonix Insider, your all-access pass to the stories shaping the future of mobility and health equity. Each episode, we dive into real-world challenges and innovative solutions that impact transportation access in communities across the country. From candid conversations with industry leaders to first-hand accounts from the individuals we serve, the Feonix Insider gives you a front-row seat as we work toward creating mobility solutions for the health and well-being of every person in every community. Join us on this journey as we pave the way for a more equitable and connected world.
Well, welcome everybody to the show. I am over the moon excited to have Dr. Colleen Casey with us today for the Feonix Insider. So a little about Dr. Casey before we dive into the conversation. Colleen is Executive Director of Driving Possibilities at Toyota North America. She leads the development of community education and industry partnerships to improve access to education and opportunity in under-resourced communities. Dr. Casey holds a Ph.D. in public policy with an emphasis in urban and community development policy. And prior to joining Toyota, Colleen spent over 10 years in higher education as a tenured professor and department chair. God bless you. Colleen has 15 years of experience publishing on economic environment and social issues and has led multiple multi-sector social impact partnerships. She also serves on Feonix Board of Directors. Thank you so much, Colleen. And outside of her professional and philanthropic pursuits, she is an avid marathon runner. And we are so excited. Welcome to the show, Colleen.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here with you today, Valerie, to have this conversation.
And so as we get started, Colleen, I always like to ask folks, what's your story? Where did you grow up? What was your first job? How did you land in transportation of all the fields?
Yeah. So as probably like others, that journey was not always a straight journey, right? There's a few twists and turns and curves and so forth. But let me start by, I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and that's where I spent the majority of my life. I went to complete my bachelor's and master's in Illinois at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. And at that point in time, I paused. I got my master's, and education was always really important to me. I was a first generation college student. And so having access to something that, my parents didn't have or my family didn't have always meant a lot. I was very grateful for that. But I paused after the master's because I started to look around me and I couldn't really understand why were communities so economically segregated? What were the factors? What were the reasons? And that curiosity really drove me to go back to get my Ph.D. in, as you mentioned, public policy, urban and community development, to understand why do these landscapes happen? What are the factors? And so I was a bit odd because I created a dissertation committee made up of an economist, a political scientist, and a sociologist, which maybe you don't ever want to do that because they see the world very, very different. But I found that really important to understand when we look at urban communities and even rural communities as I've, expanded my work. The factors and the reasons are different. But one thing that became common was the intersection between a lot of economic outcomes and access to transportation. So whenever we talk about access to housing, when we talk about access to jobs, education, transportation is always highly correlated with that. So that curiosity is really what drew me into the work and my previous research agenda, and then has moved forward into the work I do now at Toyota Motor North America, trying to holistically improve access to economic opportunities.
I can just imagine, having worked for a while in higher ed, bringing those different disciplines together on your dissertation committee. What were some of the conversations that happened, like in those rooms when, to your point, they have such different perspectives of how the world should operate. And very rarely are they put in the same room in any situation, let alone to agree on the outcome of, a work of dissertation. So if you don't mind sharing, what were some of those conversations and those aha moments that they had or you had to bring them to as you were doing your research?
Yeah. So first I have to say that something that drives me is first collaboration and complex problems. So for me, that was part of the reason I wanted those different voices in the room. Because if we look at, how the economists write about some of these issues, when we look at how the political scientists write about some of these issues, sociologists write about it, we all have different ideas of what the solution is. But when we really think, and I know you know this well, given your work with Feonix, When we go to implementation on the ground, the reality is the solution lies between those different disciplines. So a lot of times, the economists are going to look to, okay, how do we improve individual movement? How can we develop policies that target the individuals so that they can have more freedom and movement? But then the sociologists will often look at the structure of society and say, okay, if we don't change the way our organizations and institutions provide access, and it's still going to be really hard for those individuals to navigate their choices and their opportunities. And then a lot of times when you move over into the political scientist language and research, we're going to be looking at how we make these political decisions, right? How do our government agencies, how do our policies structure those opportunities? And I'm glossing over this because within each of those disciplines, there's a lot of variation. But it's really thinking about, if you couple those together, at least for me, how do we give individuals the freedom to move? How do we best support them so they can move throughout structures in society? As well as how do we then create policies that move away from some unintended consequences, but actually work more holistically to promote collaboration in some of our complicated transportation ecosystems?
And with all of that, in that dissertation conversation, Colleen, were there any points that the faculty were kind of like, well, this is my lane, this is your lane, this is your lane? Were there any points of conflict where there was debate over, well, it's this, no, it should be this, or whether they were like, we've never looked at this before in this way. I would have never guessed X, Y, or Z.
Yeah. Well, so there were those points of conflict, and the first response I have, I would have never gotten that dissertation if I could get them past those points of conflict. So that was point number one. And really doing that was really thinking about, how do you start to integrate into a framework to understand opportunity for individuals, and then how do you get data to help test that framework? So that was really, my job as a dissertation student, was to think about how these different perspectives create a new framework for how we think about access and opportunity, and then be able to test it out with data. So again, yes, those conflicts always happen. And as, we sit into policy debates or agency debates on how to deploy funding, we will always have that to some degree, even if people aren't squarely rooted in a certain discipline. But in order to act and implement, we have to find ways to overcome that for individuals.
So thinking back over just all the incredible support that you've had at Feonix and working in committees and on the board, what aspect of the work at Feonix do you think is most inspiring to you, or resonates the most based upon, your time with the organization and the work that we've done with AARP together?
Well, there's a lot of different ways I could answer this question. But again, and this is a little bit of my bias as to what I just said, it's the focus on collaboration. It's the focus on understanding there's a larger ecosystem that has got to come together with coordinated and collaborative action to make mobility possible for all. We often, if we go back to the analogy of what I was saying about having different academic disciplines, a lot of times we see people that are entrenched in their solutions in the transportation space. The solution is more bus routes. The solution is rail. The solution is this. What is so valued, and why I'm so excited to be on the board of Feonix, is the organization is looking at this differently. It's how do we start to create and cultivate that ecosystem that works in different types of communities, because we all know all communities have access to resources and assets, but how do we fit into that and make it work so the individual, again, gets those opportunities based on what they need, based on where they are in their life journey. So if I had to boil it down to one word, I'd say collaboration.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that, Colleen. I think the ability to, in Feonix's unique role as as I sometimes say, the flexi-seal of mobility, we're able to bring things together, or maybe the crochet of mobility, where we can bring things together and in each piece still maintain its, we want the transit agency to have a very successful, healthy system. We want the small businesses to provide rides, to have thriving employees and operations, and volunteers. We want to be fulfilled as they serve in their community. So I think that collaboration approach, whether that be from the providers that actually serve and provide the rides, but also the city council, the county commissioners, the hospital administrators. Just this morning, I was talking to a community in Shawano, Wisconsin, and it was really about how do we look at employment? How do we look at healthcare? How do we look at the connectivity in the community, and especially in a community where there wasn't a lot of transportation options, and how do you fill those gaps? And I think that collaboration and having everybody at the table to kind of say, what are our options? Who do we look to? What are the resources that aren't here yet, but we could find, or we could repurpose to make those things possible? So thank you.
Well, thank you.
All right.
For leading that work. It's not easy. It's not easy.
You see this gray hair, Colleen? Yeah. So, Colleen, as an academic, as an expert, but also a practitioner at one of the world's largest OEMs, how do you define mobility, and why do you feel, based upon your work and education and expertise in this area, why is it important to focus on mobility across all ages, right? Like, we've talked a lot about economic opportunity, but spanning that entire bridge of, yesterday we were talking in the National Academy of Science meeting on skill and technical workforce, and there's a new term out there called K2 gray. And I thought that was an interesting framework, but it is really from kindergarten or even birth to your final days, and mobility is needed your entire life. So how do you define it, and why do you believe it's critical?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I like the K through, actually, I'd probably say pre-K through gray. But I like that. And this is a little simplified, but, I think about two dimensions when I think about mobility. First, from a definitional standpoint, it's the ability for people to move freely, both across physical places, starting with your own living room, your own house, through your community, through your region and beyond. And then second, in social structures, because again, these two, mobility is not the ends, but is definitely the means for your quality of life. And so I always think of it in that way. So two dimensions, ability to move across your physical space at whatever level that is, and then also your ability to move throughout your social structures. It is so important when we think about aging, and we'll go back to the pre-K, I'm going to call it the pre-K through gray, because along that journey, our needs change, right? You think when you're pre-K, you're crawling around that living room, but that's still mobility for you. It's just a little bit limited. When you go through, your education, your job search, and your time where you're, seeking employment and you're working throughout your life, that mobility is so important to give you access to those opportunities so you can pursue them. And then as we get older, sometimes we can continue, if we own a personal vehicle, we can continue driving. Sometimes we lose that opportunity. Sometimes we're not able to do that. But if that's taken away from us, we can no longer participate in our social structures, right? That ability, if one does lose their ability to operate their vehicle anymore, or does not have access to a reliable transportation source to get them from point A to point B, their quality of life diminishes because they miss that social opportunity. So I think it's really important for us to focus on it, because it changes based on where we are on that pre-K through gray spectrum, as well as what opportunities we have access to, whether that's an individual source, whether that's public transportation, whether that's a private source that provides a driver, or a volunteer driver. And I think that's what's so important, as I mentioned before, when we talk about collaboration, one's access might need different forms. And that's why it's so important to build that whole ecosystem that can respond across that age continuum.
Yeah. I mean, and I think, even, when you talk about crawling around the living room, at that point, your parents are taking you, or your guardian is taking you to those appointments and those kind of things. And then again, to the end toward those final days, somebody else is taking you. Maybe your child is taking you, or there's another program that's taking you. And I think that ecosystem of not only the mode, but also that person or that support structure that needs to be there to whether you're trying to get to your vaccinations for kindergarten or whether you're trying to get to hospice, right? There has to be another kind of social ecosystem that is existing to make sure that everything is going how it needs to go or as well. Do you feel like as a society, we're getting ready to talk about challenges, do you feel that, some of the work that Toyota has done is around all the other innovations that go along with supporting somebody in their home? Do you feel there's enough conversation around that, first and last mile or that social support that's needed beyond just, I'm trying to figure out the question I'm trying to ask here, because it's like there's so many different pieces to this question to unpack. I guess, what is your perspective on, do we as a society talk enough about those pieces of connectivity?
So I think we talk about it. However, I think we talk about it within our own areas of expertise or practitioner knowledge or policy circles. So for example, right, the place I feel we need to start talking more about is how do we connect that individual's journey to wherever they're trying to go. So for example, in my mind, your journey starts from your home, wherever you live. You have to get out of that house to get somewhere. Inside that home could be a lot of barriers for somebody to get out the front door. If they have steps and they need to use, a wheelchair or a walker, then if they don't have the right entry ramp out of their home, they're never getting to whatever service is picking them up. So I feel we have these conversations, but I feel in many cases we're having them in different spaces. And it's almost, say, take away what our respective areas of expertise are, right? I focus on public transit, or I focus on paratransit. I focus on, rail. Right. And start to talk about what's our customer's journey? What is a person's journey? And then developing solutions around that and getting the different viewpoints, those that know, okay, what is safe for in-home mobility? And I'm leaning a little bit here towards an older older American population. How do we make that part of the journey safe? How do we create safety to get out of the homes? And then how do we match that with the correct type of transportation based on what that individual needs? We see a lot of cases, well, we can provide this type of service, but we don't do door through store service, right? So you got to be able to get in a car. Well, that just cut out an option for a lot of people. So I think what we talk about it in our respective circles and around our specific solutions to the problem, but we have an opportunity to bring the different experts together to craft what does that ideal set of solutions look like for various customer journeys based on age, place in their mobility life.
It's like that dissertation committee all over again.
Yep.
Where you've got, you have your transit, you have your community regional planners, you've got your infrastructure, you have your housing folks, and then you have
policy
the funding
programmers, those funding, right?
Yeah, exactly. That committee keeps meeting over and over again.
Yep.
And I think it brings me back to, there was a gentleman who was a veteran we were serving in the Coastal Bend area, and the public transit couldn't go up his driveway because it wasn't paved. It wasn't even very well rocked. It was mud, basically, or dirt. And when it rained, he could not get a ride because his wheelchair would get stuck in the mud trying to get down the driveway, and the bus couldn't get up the driveway. And I feel like that is such a contextual thing that it really comes down to these very nuanced details when it comes to what is that customer experience. I think that was one of the most important pieces that I really appreciated when I was working with Ajay and Gary on that NEMIT pilot was, they talked about the riders as what is the ultimate customer experience we can give them in that program. And so often in transportation, it's like, well, we're providing adequate service, but we don't talk about customer service. And what is that customer journey? So
And I'll add, because I think this is the important of the ecosystem, right? This is where too, and going back to what I mentioned about what excites me the most about the work Feonix is doing in this space is this collaboration, the ability to think about how do we build this ecosystem. That also means there's a role for community-based organizations, nonprofits, volunteers. Like as a society, as we understand that, there's different ways we can address locally the challenges faced across that journey. Because again, when we think about funding and federal policies that's get down into states, there's a focus on scale there. Some of these localized contextual issues are challenging to do through those mechanisms. But understanding and surfacing that and then convening the right local players around the table can start to solve for those. An example that's coming into my head, at least locally here in Texas, is there's what's known as the Texas Ramp Project. It's literally a group of volunteers that go around and make sure people have ramps so they can overcome that barrier that I mentioned. You lost your ability to maneuver steps. You need a ramp. They go around and volunteer. That couples nicely then with whoever can provide the service, right, for that individual. So we have to get creative in these local contexts and then figure out how do we best use our larger policies and programs to support that flexibility, to support that innovation, so we actually get solutions that match the needs of the journeys that individuals need.
1,000% agree. And I think the RAMP project is such a great articulation of how public-private partnerships and how community come together. And also how in policy we need to reserve time and space where if we can get people to donate their time, can we get organizations to get funding from the government to pay for the resources, right? Or are there other programs? Because aging in place and staying in your own home, I think I shared a couple weeks ago that this writer in Ann Arbor who in her yard was a tree that was buried in honor of her daughter when her daughter passed away. And the thought of leaving her home is also like, I'd leave a part of my daughter behind. And to be able to say, you can still get to groceries, you can still get to church and live in your home, which is much cheaper for society than if you were to ask somebody to say, well, you can no longer drive and you don't live on a bus route or a walkable distance to a bus stop. So you're moving now into assisted living or whatever, which is easily $5,000 to $7,000 per month for Medicaid to pay, all because these micro barriers, not to mention the mental health that goes along with being able to age in place. So we've already started digging into these challenges, Colleen. Like, what do you see are some of the key challenges communities face when it comes to mobility, and how does it impact economic mobility?
Yeah, so let me move towards another area on our pre-K through Gray. I hope I'm not, stealing that from anybody, but I really do like it. And I'll just use the example of education right now. We've come to know that, at least from public schools, most students we come to believe most students have access to transportation through public schools because we have a bus system. But we've also found that bus system does not always work well. So particularly in rural communities, we see there's challenges in terms of long commutes, which can impact and correlate with how students perform in school, their ability to get to school should they miss the bus. So attendance drops, achievement drops. As well as we see challenges because some policies have, if you're within a mile or mile and a half, you can't use the bus, right? You need to walk or, ride your bike to school. But we know all communities aren't safe. There's not necessarily safe pedestrian infrastructure to support that. So you're putting a child at risk. So, I'm just going back to that. This impacts economic opportunity because we're starting to impact a student's ability to have a quality education and fully participate in that education, which leads to job and economic opportunity. The second place, and I want to draw on an example that we actually have a project we partnered with the Dallas area rapid transit, and we still are partners with them on that here in Dallas, Texas, is, we went in and we support some educational initiatives in this community. And we learned right away that, through our focus groups and community conversations, there is a significant gap in access to reliable and affordable transportation. There were bus routes, there were public transit stops, but not everybody could get to them. And again, this is a community that lacks a very strong public pedestrian infrastructure. So we decided to bring into the community, based on the recommendations of the residents, they wanted a circulator. They wanted something they could hop on and hop off of that could help connect them to grocery stores, to shopping areas, to the transit stations. And so we piloted this at first, and it's an electric shuttle that runs. We've got several of them in partnership, running through the community. And what we saw was an uptick in transit ridership, because people could now more people from the community could now get to the transit. We also saw an uptick in sales. There's a local Walmart, right? There's a whole shopping center that was before very difficult to access because the distance you would need to walk and carry things was very challenging. So we saw an uptick in sales and shopping and revenue. That's a benefit to a business. So, I share this, that when we have systems that work well, not just is there economic opportunity that comes back to the individual, as in my example, thinking about, if we can get the school transportation optimized, but there's also a benefit that comes back to businesses. And overall, then we start to raise the whole community. So, I think it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. Those are just two examples. But again, for communities to function well, we need access. People need to be able to move freely, and not only will the individual benefit, but so too will the other businesses and organizations in that space.
Yeah, I think you bring up, just wow. And I think those conversations, when we talk about what is the impact of mobility, what is the impact of transportation, I think those pieces often, at least in a lot of the community conversations, there's not enough ROI data, or there's very little, there's not a person to speak up and say, this is why it matters. Or if there is, it's then, well, that's just the one person. But this is millions of children that face this barrier, that first and last mile and a half, or just being neurodiverse on a bus for an hour and a half. As a rural kid who grew up, and my bus, depending on the semester, half the year we got home and it took an hour and 10 minutes from when the school bell rang, or it took 20 minutes. They flipped it. They were generous depending on, which semester. But there were children who had autism and were very high end of the spectrum. And that bus ride was sheer torture. Mm-hmm. And if there were students who got car sick or who had severe nausea on the bus. So imagine, I can't even imagine starting my day an hour and a half or an hour and 15 minutes, depending on where you were at in the bus structure, being sick and nauseous. And then you're supposed to jump in and take your spelling test, right? What does that do to children? Right. Or we were talking with a school system in Western Nebraska. And it's that, I think in Nebraska, it's 3 miles, at least in the rural areas. If you live within 3 miles of school district, you have to walk. And in that part of the state, it gets negative degree weather with, 40, 50 mile an hour winds in the winter. And, you've got kindergartners who have wet hair, where mom and dad or mom and grandma or whoever is at home had to leave for work at 6 that morning. So you've got little kids, either brother and sister getting them ready, or they're getting themselves ready, expected to walk that 2 miles to school. And the state law or whatever prohibits that school bus from operating that close. And so in that case, we're like, what are we going to do? Can we contact the Knights of Columbus or some other philanthropic organization to help fill that gap? But in a lot of cases, there aren't people getting together having those conversations about how important is mobility. And if you start out in your day, every day, with being picked on or being bullied or, psychologically exhausted, and then you're going in to take your math test or your algebra test or your whatever point of grade you are in, because mom and dad may not have the funds to buy you a car when you're in high school and you're still riding the bus, right? That experience changes your educational opportunities. And schools don't have a way to resettle you once you get started. It's you hit first period and you go.
Yeah.
And I think there isn't enough conversation around that transition, around that challenge, from all grades. But I think that how that sets a kid up for success academically is such an important conversation around how do we further support students. We're talking about we provide free and reduced lunch, we provide the bus, but is the bus right for everybody? Or, some of these other conversations. So, yeah. And then this whole, by providing mobility, we're creating economic opportunity for other businesses to be a part of those ecosystems. I think there's so much that the mobility, I think APTA, the American Public Transit Association, I think their most recent figure says for every dollar you invest in transportation or public transportation, $5 more comes back to the economy, whether that be supporting businesses or those kind of things. So, in your journey working in communities, is there any story in particular, Colleen, where you're like, this is why I do this, that comes to mind, whether you're talking with a family or a business owner or a writer? Or
well, and I want to circle back just on a couple points that, because actually, this has a ripple effect. So going back to your example where a student, they may be either sick on the bus or, face some challenges on that long commute. They get into the school and then they have to jump into the lesson or the test. The other thing that we're learning too, because our teachers, right? Teachers are teachers because they care and they want to empower their students.
Absolutely.
We find what happens in many cases is teachers then are trying to address the challenges they see the students having as a result of that, which takes away their time to actually deliver on the lesson. So it just creates a number of ripple effects. And, I don't want to come across as being critical of the bus system because it solves the needs for a large amount of students, but it doesn't solve them for all. So again, this is where we need to think about the innovation and have the flexibility to really understand the variations in a student's journey and how do we create some creative means to be able to support those. Going back to your question about the example. So I'm going to draw on one from many years ago. One of the first projects I worked on here when I was at Toyota is we were trying to understand some of the some of the transportation challenges faced in a rural community in the state of Mississippi. And this was a community that did not have any public transportation whatsoever. We know, and again, our approach and my approach in my work has always been, let's understand the problem before we jump to what the solution is, right? So a lot of meetings with stakeholders, a lot of conversations, focus groups to understand. And we heard over and over again 2 stories. One, for new job seekers, people that had not historically been in the job market, whether it's their first job or they faced some other challenges and they were getting ready to make that transition. The number, and I don't remember the actual specific data points and percentages anymore, a large percentage of those individuals were using a rideshare service to get to work every day. So they were coming into the workplace at a very, entry-level salary, spending almost 50%, maybe upwards of that, of their income to get to their workplace. So that was challenge number one that stood out for me. And then the second was, of those individuals that didn't choose that, some of them walked up to 5 miles to get to that job location. Those stood out to me because there is this thing, if you don't have, first we got to figure out what is the right service and solution for individuals. Second, we have to understand if those things are not there, we are creating additional burdens for people to move forward. If we go back to the definition I said before, right, there's physical mobility and then there's your ability to move through your social structure. We are not helping people get that access to move up that economic structure because then they can't really get ahead. So this, again, this gap in having access to some form of physical mobility, I'm going to call transportation more direct here, puts people behind or delays their ability to really be able to experience economic opportunity. So those are 2 that stood out in my mind from many, many years ago.
Yeah. And I think that walking distance, I think that is definitely, one of those things whether you're biking or you're walking, those distances when it's beautiful weather, good for our health. Great. I mean, you're a marathon runner, right? Like, fabulous. But when you're thinking about rain, you're thinking about snow, you're thinking about wind, a 5-mile walk in the rain is completely different than a beautiful day.
Right.
And we were serving this gentleman in Wisconsin, and he was walking 6 miles to and from work along a highway, and you go into communal regional planning. Very few, I can count on one hand the number of times I've seen a rural highway that has a pedestrian or a cyclist lane that isn't just the shoulder, right?
Right.
And then when it snows out or whatever, where you walk is muddy or frozen, or there are snow plows. And so you are forced to ride or walk in the road lane because the snow plows are doing their best, but often the shoulder is not their priority. And so, I think there's not enough conversation around what that means when we just say, we'll just walk,
Right.
or heaven forbid you have a knee injury, or, that doesn't count the miles you're walking to take your kid to daycare and dropping them off and then going next. So I really appreciate you bringing up those two examples. So continuing this conversation, can you share examples of how mobility has directly, I know you talked about the example in Mississippi, where it's directly contributed to economic opportunities that you've seen in certain regions or other communities where, it was status quo when you started, and then because of the work, because of the partnerships in the community, because of the conversations and resources that were brought to bear, you saw additional impact.
Yeah, and I think the results of that Mississippi work was to create a system that people could actually use. And so we did see increased access to jobs. We also learned in that situation too, that there is a whole community of persons with disabilities that had no reliable sources of transportation. And so that, yes, economic opportunities, so more could gain employment, but also socially. We found that changed the ability to go out and participate in society for so many people in that particular community. So I think those are our two key ones. The other, as we think about I'm going to go back to like the student population again. The gap between students so we've got the challenge, right? Like you might be on a commute and that could affect student achievement. The other challenge we see is that internships. So if you don't have personal transportation, this is a much harder problem to solve for when we think about traditional, school transportation, because you need something on demand, because not everybody's going to have an internship in the same place. And we run into this problem many, many times. And it's, students are doing well in school, and then they have this opportunity to have an internship with a top company or career field of their choice. And what we've actually heard is because of this challenge and there's no option for them, people redirect students to internship opportunities that are nearby. I'm like, how is that fair and equitable? If a student they've worked so hard through school and they want to go into this career, it's a further distance away, but there's no transportation. So we're going to redirect them to this. And it's just not, to me, if we think about, what is equitable, that is not equitable. Yes, you're giving them an opportunity, an internship, but you're also changing their choice structure and their experience rather than closing the gap that they have to get to where they want to go. So I think that's, not quantifiable in that sense. But it can change a student's trajectory of where they can go when we don't actually solve for the real problem.
Yeah, without a doubt. I think the research, there's actually, I forget who published the study, but there is actually research that indicates, for students who come from low income households or students who are of color, there is less opportunity and for internships. There's less opportunity that's given for summer training opportunities. Going back yesterday, I was at that workshop at the National Academy of Sciences. One of the students was there from Alaska. And, you want to talk about transportation barriers and challenges, talking about what internships are optional. He had to take a plane to get to an internship, and those opportunities, if we're talking about educational outcomes and equitable educational resources, whether it's at the community college or the technical school, and I'm an adult learner and I'm going back after being in the workforce, or I'm that 20-year-old kid that worked so hard to get to where I'm at and have these grades to get these amazing opportunities. But you've got mom who's basically using her grocery money to fund rides from their son or daughter to get from point A to point B during the summer so that they can have that experience. And I think that is such an incredible part of, the student experience that, we've talked about, and there's money specifically for older adults or individuals with disabilities for transportation. But when it comes to education, there's at least something that is provided, at the university or the K-12 level, but it's very localized. It's very segmented. It does not look at the whole person's experience or the full set of opportunities. And you just think about what else are we missing when we think about, like, there's food pantries that have now started to be added to campuses because they realized there are barriers in students being able to feed themselves and nourish their families, right? We're talking with one of the colleges there, and the majority of their students are working parents. And when you can't feed your family, it's really hard to focus on your course curriculum, It's really hard to both physiologically and emotionally invest your time when you feel like you're failing your family at that very basic level, or you yourself are hungry. And I think that too often that stuff just gets glossed over. So I appreciate the incredible work, Colleen, that you're doing to raise the visibility of these challenges in the communities, because not enough people are talking about it.
Yeah. Well, and to add to that, the work that I'm currently doing now with Toyota, we support under-resourced communities across the K through 12 to increase access to STEM. So we support in 4 areas, right? The curriculum, because we know that's important, right? And we see that earlier students get less of that access to this quality STEM education curriculum. Teacher professional development to make sure teachers have the time and the preparation to deliver that. But then the last part of that is the mobility and basic needs, because exactly to your point, we can put the best STEM curriculum in place all day long. But if a student can't have access to food, they can't focus on what that STEM curriculum is. If the family doesn't have access to transportation for healthcare, then the student's more likely to also miss school. So again, can't fully participate in that education. So we have to think, and this is why I go back to the collaboration, and these are complex problems, but we've got so many smart people and so many good solutions out there. If we can fit the pieces of the puzzle together, we can solve them. But it takes different experts and practitioners that have that know-how coming together to really solve for these challenges.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, in 2024, right, we're putting equipment on Mars, right? And we're putting people in outer space, but we struggle to figure out how to make sure that our children are nourished and how to make sure that the folks can get where they need to go to be well. It's such a dichotomous challenge. And I think if only we as a society could put more, not that I don't think it's important that we have a robot on Mars and we're discovering life in other places, but there's billions and billions and billions of dollars going into some of these initiatives. And it's like, what if we were to take a little bit more of those budgets, and put them towards these critical things? I think because of the partnerships and the resourcefulness of communities, folks would be able to go really far with that. But that's my magic wand.
Well, and I think too, we have opportunity, and I think this goes back to the importance of getting people around the table, because we do have resources, but we're not connecting the resources. So we might be creating redundancies in the system, or we might not be able to using them as effectively as we could. So while yes, additional dollars is always going to be of value, we probably have opportunities to better use the resources that we have. And then I think the second piece of that is also being able to take some steps to pilot some things that are new. This is often hard when we look at existing, federal, state funds, there's often a restriction on doing something more innovative. And it's understandable, right? There's tax dollars. We're accountable to citizens. So we don't want to necessarily do something that doesn't work. But in most cases, anything great we've done in this country or in this world, we've made some mistakes along the way. So that ability to think about how do we have resources that can actually support some pilots? Let's get people around. Let's try something different. Let's be okay with that. If it doesn't work, we will learn something from it rather than kind of doing things the way we've done before. So yes, more resources are always valuable, but I also think we need to be more focused on how are we using those resources jointly in coordinated action to solve some of these challenges.
And I think that the background of policy of this, right? Like a lot of times, for example, you talk about resource allocation, the use of the buses or that 1.5 miles, or, some of these other variances of how far can paratransit go? What are the insurance limitations? I think that's that next step, because I feel like we've had a lot of cases where folks came around the table and then it got stopped short because of, oh, well, that rule is this way. And we don't know even where to begin to see how could we adjust this, or even who to call to find out who would adjust it if it is possible. And I think that next step of policy, to your point, is when you get those folks around the table, and why it takes collaboration. Who makes that phone call? Who knows the person to then say, well, here, this is written this way, and that's what's preventing us from doing this, or we need this agreement in place to give to the insurance company or whatever. Like, that's that next level of how do we optimize the resources, and then how do we work together to break through the red tape or the policy barriers, whether that be in transit or highways or community regional planning or HUD or food insecurity. I mean, during the pandemic, I think that was one of the most inspiring things to me. Not that there's ever anything good that comes with it. There's a global pandemic, but that was some of the silver lining of a lot of the things that people had said, well, we can't do it that way because X, Y, and Z. Magically, with thousands of people, millions of people passing away because of this major pandemic, we can bend the rules and see what happens. And I think from the perspective is a lot of counties, a lot of cities, a lot of government funded organizations really got the opportunity to think outside the box with some severe urgency that generally in some cases isn't always felt, or there's not capacity, or when you're going to a funeral every other week in talking to some of these leaders, your sense of purpose is risen. In addition to just always working 20-hour days or long days, they're saying, well, we're going to do this, and we're going to ask for forgiveness, not for permission.
Ask for forgiveness. Yep.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, let's close this out. Thank you so much for this great conversation, Colleen, with some rapid fire questions.
All right.
So let's fill in the blank. Mobility equity is
the ability to move freely wherever you want to go at whatever age you are.
Okay. What is one piece of leadership advice that is so great you must share it, or so awful you need to warn us?
Make decisions by knowing your people and your customers.
Ooh. All right. The last TV show you binged on and loved.
All right. So I'm going to cheat a little bit here because I don't watch a lot of television by choice, but I do watch a lot of track and field as I am a runner. So it was the Diamond League. So for those that don't know, it's a series of track and field competitions across the world. So I was a little upset when the Olympics ended and I didn't have any more track and field, but that series picked up. So I've been watching that.
Okay. If you could wave a magic wand and solve one aspect of inequity in transportation, what would you fix and why?
Flexibility. We need more flexibility.
And so to expand a little bit on that, when you say flexibility,
flexibility to be innovative within the system.
Just loosen the red tape or get rid of the red tape.
Yes, yes.
What is one thing that you think significantly is under-discussed in the transportation industry that you feel not enough people are talking about?
Yeah. So I talked a little bit about this, but it's the customer's journey that starts inside wherever they live and ends whenever they get to where their final destination is. I think that's an area, again, people are talking about in their own circles, but we have an opportunity to talk about that together and bring that together.
Yeah. Yeah. And what rooms do you think we need to bring that to, Colleen? You know, when you think about it's under discussed and it's happening in silos, where's the places that you think it should be discussed? Where do we need to start?
I mean, this is where, I think it has to go back to the customer that we're talking about first and foremost, right? Because I think the players in the room are going to look different based on who we're talking about. If we're talking about a child, right? Or a family with a young child versus if we're talking about somebody that's an older American. So if I just use an example of an older American, I would like to see all of our occupational and physical therapists around the table talking about how do we actually solve the mobility journey, right? In conjunction with our planning experts, our transportation experts. That's a whole realm of knowledge that knows and has worked so closely with many older Americans and know the opportunities and challenges. So that's just one example, but I think it depends on whose journey we're talking about. And then we get the right people around the table.
Yeah, I love that example of bringing the occupational therapy and physical therapists. I think they see firsthand. Like we were in New London, Wisconsin last week, talking with a group of nurses and case managers. And one of the things that they talked about was the fall risk of somebody waiting in the emergency room in one case, somebody waited 13 hours in the waiting room to get picked up. And that the average cost of a fall was about $40,000 to the hospital. And so when you think about if it's $40,000 to help somebody, get back up and deal with all the healthcare needs and things when somebody falls and there's an injury, how much more could we put those resources into making sure there's more mobility in these communities?
Yep, exactly.
All right. Something fun. Favorite concert of all time?
Tina Turner. I saw her when she was like 60 and she was just amazing. I'm like, how are you doing that at 60? Yeah, she's phenomenal.
Was she in Vegas or where was she
she's
at?
actually in St. Louis, Missouri.
No.
Yes. She came to St. Louis. I'm like, I have to go. But she was like just moving around, ticking and dancing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you're amazing. I can't do that right now. And I was much younger than I am now. So, but yeah, favorite for sure.
Okay. What is one thing you are deeply grateful for right now?
Right now, my husband and my 2 dogs.
Oh. What kind of dogs?
Portuguese water dogs. I have a 14-year-old and a 2-year-old. So the 14-year-old's getting older. She's slowing down. So I'm very grateful every day we still have her with us.
And this is my naivety about what a Portuguese water dog looks like. Do they ever go running with you?
So they don't. They're better swimmers. So they like water and they swim. They're not so big on the running. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I should follow the clock. I don't have children. So it's not that I'm not grateful for my children. I just don't have them. So nobody judges.
Isn't that strange? This is society now, right? Like we have to let me put this out there. PSA.
And I qualify that a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. What was your favorite place on earth, Colleen?
So this one changes based on time of year. So given that I'm in Texas right now and it is summer keeps continuing, right now where I want to go is the mountains of Colorado because they're starting to get snow. So that's right now my favorite place. But that changes every now and then. So
where at in Colorado, if you don't mind me asking?
I like
you have a favorite?
Out in Eagle County, out by Vail and Leadville and Minturn. So you can get the high mountains, but you can also get down a little bit lower. So yeah.
There is just something soul filling about the mountains.
Agree.
Like there's just a certain sense of inspiration and peace and healing.
I agree.
when you get on the mountain this summer, I had the opportunity to take a horse ride through some of the mountains in Wyoming. And
Oh, wonderful.
like there's no medication for what that feels like to just have that moment and just look out over the mountaintops. And maybe it's the thinner air, I guess.
I don't know. But then you get the changing seasons. So even if it's not, snow and ski season, the changing of the trees, the aspens out in that area, beautiful, beautiful pops of yellow. And then this time of year, you can have a little bit of the changing leaves. Then you can also have a little snowfall. So it's very nice after a long, dry, hot Texas summer.
Absolutely. Well, Colleen, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights on just all the things that we talked about with mobility and economic opportunity and pre-K to gray. It's been a wonderful conversation and so grateful for your time. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us on the Feonix Insider, where we explore the road to mobility equity together. Don't forget to subscribe and share this episode with your network to keep the conversation going. Together, we can break down transportation barriers and create lasting change. Visit Feonix.org to find out how you can help improve access for everyone. We'll catch you next time on the Feonix Insider as we continue driving forward toward a more equitable future.